Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 109. By this point, you've probably figured out that I enjoy language, books, and anything connected with textual scholarship. To me, these are fascinating topics. Years ago, I read several books by literary scholar and Ohio State professor Richard Altick. In one, he describes the excitement that a library's papery smell evokes in scholars. That statement resonated with me. Yes, that's a little weird, but that's how I feel. Today's topic excites me too because we're going to talk about some very old books. I'm also going to discuss some of the issues surrounding what is called textual criticism, a field of study that developed around biblical manuscripts. So let's smell the paper and get started. In our last podcast, we examined the manuscripts associated with the Old Testament. We learned about the work of the Masoretes and the authoritative edition of the Hebrew Bible that they produced. Today we're going back to somewhat earlier times to examine the oldest manuscripts of the New Testament. Let me begin this discussion by defining a term that I used in the last podcast and that you'll be hearing a few times today: codex. A codex is a handwritten manuscript that's made from individual pages bound into a volume that looks very much like a modern book. Books are such a part of our culture that it's hard to imagine them as having forms other than the ones we're familiar with. But through much of history, books were quite different. Instead of the individual leaves being bound together on one side, many early books were made from pages glued together into a single long strip of material. This was rolled up to form a scroll. Scrolls could be impressively long. Some are well over 100 feet. They have the disadvantage of being bulky and cumbersome to read. If you want to consult a page near the end, you have to roll your way through the entire book to get there. Scrolls developed into what we think of as books through a series of steps. In Roman times, someone had the idea of folding the scroll like an accordion rather than rolling it up. This made it more compact, but it wasn't much easier to read. Next, someone realized that instead of gluing the individual pages together end to end, it made more sense to assemble them into a stack and glue or sew them along just one edge. Books haven't changed much since this innovation. Ancient books were made from a variety of materials. Sheets of pulped wood or other plant fibers, what we call paper, wasn't one of them, however. The Chinese invented paper in the 2nd century BC, but it didn't reach the Middle East and Europe until the Middle Ages. Instead, the ancient world used an ancestor of paper called papyrus. Papyrus is made from strips cut from an aquatic, grass-like plant with thick triangular stems. These are soaked in water for several days and laid in a crisscross pattern. Then they're compressed under a heavy weight and dried. The resulting sheets look like rather thick, fibrous paper. But they're quite durable and will last a long time if they're properly stored. As you may recall from an earlier podcast, I mentioned the Villa of the Papyri near Mount Vesuvius in Italy. This ancient library contained thousands of papyrus scrolls. An alternative to papyrus was parchment, stretched, bleached, and scraped animal skins. These provided a fine, smooth surface for writing. High-quality parchment made from calf skin is called vellum. It was used for the most expensive and important books. Okay, that's enough about books in general. Let's get back to some specific books, those that make up the New Testament. While the autographs of the New Testament are no longer with us, the early church vigorously copied them and circulated those copies. During the first few centuries of the early church, the Roman world was, no doubt, awash with these. Some still exist as papyrus manuscript fragments or single New Testament books. A few go back as far as AD 200. One set of complete Bibles that we know about was prepared by the church historian and bishop Eusebius. In AD 331, the Emperor Constantine I asked Eusebius to prepare 50 copies of the Bible for use in the churches of Constantinople. We don't know many details about these Bibles since Eusebius mentions them only briefly. As they were prepared before the canon had been finalized, we're also uncertain about which New Testament books they contained and which they omitted. It is from the copies of this period that our oldest complete New Testament manuscripts come. You should know about 4 of these. The oldest complete New Testament is part of a Bible known as Codex Sinaiticus. It was assembled sometime between AD 300 and 350. This Bible, written on vellum, includes a complete set of New Testament books, part of the Old Testament Septuagint, and a number of intertestamental apocryphal books. It also includes the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas, both New Testament-era apocryphal books. Constantine von Tischendorf, a pioneer of modern Bible textual scholarship, discovered Codex Sinaiticus in 1844 at the monastery of St. Catherine near Mount Sinai. In the late 20th century, 8 additional pages were found during renovations at the monastery. The codex has been split up and now resides in 4 locations. Most of it is in the British Library in London. A digital copy is available online for anyone to use. Just as a point of interest, Constantine von Tischendorf believed that Codex Sinaiticus was one of the 50 Bibles prepared by Eusebius. Most scholars disagree with this opinion on a variety of grounds. It's a romantic idea, but probably untrue. Codex Sinaiticus is important because it's among the oldest copies of the New Testament in existence. It's therefore presumed to be close to the autographs. For this reason, textual scholars value it highly, and it plays a major role in manuscript studies. Codex Vaticanus was assembled in the early 4th century, about the same time as Codex Sinaiticus. Written on vellum, it includes most of the Old Testament and much of the New. Several intertestamental apocryphal books are also present. Some pages are clearly replacements for lost pages since they're written in a different writing system than the rest of the manuscript. Also, a number of punctuation marks have been added to the text at a later date as well. Scholars aren't sure where it originally came from, although there are numerous theories. It takes its name from the Vatican Library, where it was kept since the late 1400s. Various scholars do mention this manuscript collection prior to the early 19th century, but it wasn't extensively studied. During the Napoleonic Wars, it was taken as a trophy to Paris, but later returned to the Vatican. Interest in textual scholarship increased during the 19th century, so scholars were understandably eager to consult Codex Vaticanus to compare it with other manuscripts. Unfortunately, the Vatican librarians were uncooperative and obstructive, so few scholars received meaningful access. A printed copy was published in 1857, but it was of poor quality and not especially useful. Not until 1889 was a photographic copy published. This opened the manuscript to textual study, and it became a major factor in modern scholarship. In 2015, a digital copy was made available online. The manuscript itself remains in the Vatican Library. Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus contain what is currently believed to be the oldest, essentially complete New Testament manuscripts. A third manuscript, Codex Alexandrinus, was assembled sometime between AD 400 and 450. Written on vellum, it contains an essentially complete Old Testament and New Testament, along with several intertestamental and New Testament-era apocryphal books. It probably came from the Egyptian city of Alexandria, and was given by the Patriarch of Constantinople to the British King Charles I in the 1620s. It currently resides in the British Library. As with Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, it's available online. The fourth manuscript is a very unusual one because it's a document known as a palimpsest. These both fascinate and frustrate scholars. A palimpsest is produced by a kind of recycling process. It begins life as an original document that's no longer needed. A scribe removes the original text by washing or scraping. Then, a new text is written onto the clean surface. In our age of throwaway paper, it's hard to understand the reason for palimpsests. But when you consider the cost of writing materials in these time periods, they make more sense. When a scholar discovers a palimpsest with an interesting original layer, it's exciting, almost like discovering a treasure. But deciphering the remains of the original text can be extremely difficult. Today, using technological techniques, it's much easier. But a century or two ago, scholars had nothing but their eyes and brains. The palimpsest we're discussing is called Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. Originally, it was a biblical manuscript of the Old and New Testaments, plus some of the intertestamental apocryphal books. Later, it was repurposed as a copy of the works of Ephraim the Syrian, a theologian of the 4th century. It takes its name from this history. No one is sure where this manuscript originated. It came from Constantinople to Florence, Italy in the 1450s. It wound up in France in the early 1600s. Today it resides in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. An online version is available. It's particularly intriguing to examine since it's really two texts, one on top of the other. Starting in the early 1700s, textual scholars tried to make out the biblical text below the upper text. Most had little success. Chemicals were applied to try to improve the legibility of the lower layer, but they did little good and just darkened the vellum on which the book was written. Our old friend, Constantine von Tischendorf, was the first to successfully read and transcribe this document. When he published it in 1843 and 1845, it made him famous among textual scholars. The biblical manuscript probably dates from around AD 450. So it's around the same age as Codex Alexandrinus, but not as old as Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. As with these manuscripts, it's important in early manuscript textual studies. I should probably mention as an aside that while these 4 manuscripts are highly significant to our modern understanding of the original text, they were not especially significant at the time they were written. At that time, each was just another copy serving its purpose in the early days of the Church. One final note as we finish up today's podcast. All of the manuscripts that we've discussed today were written in a form of Greek writing called uncials. This is a fancy way of saying they were written entirely in uppercase Greek letters. This style of writing was fairly common at the time these manuscripts were prepared. For this reason, they're sometimes called the 4 Great Uncials. Manuscripts from later periods were written in lowercase letters or a mixture of upper and lowercase. The proper term for these is minuscule and majuscule text. Textual scholars use the presence of minuscule and majuscule characters to help date manuscripts. It's also interesting that many of these manuscripts are written without spaces or punctuation to assist the reader. They're just long strings of characters that flow from one line to the next with few interruptions. In some cases, later scribes added punctuation marks and spots to facilitate easier reading. The world of books was definitely different than ours today. Since all of these manuscripts are available online, I strongly urge you to look them up. Until the advent of the Internet, being able to see the oldest New Testament manuscripts was something only a few were able to do. And having satisfied my own love of books, I'm finished. I hope you found this topic interesting rather than just technical and tedious. In our next podcast, we're going to prepare to discuss Bible translation. While we think of translation in light of our current world, the Bible has been undergoing translation for well over 2,000 years. Since we need to understand the process and the issues surrounding it, we'll get started on this topic next time. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon, and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.